Yeah, thank you. So your research is on human systems and rising sea levels, right?
Yeah. I study the response to sea level rise in South Florida, how people are perceiving the risk or not perceiving the risk because it's in the future, and it happens really slowly. So it's something that we project, that we imagine will happen, based on scientific models and estimates from the past. So like we know that over the past 100 years, the oceans around the world have been rising about 1 millimeter per year, a little bit more than 1 millimeter. But sometime, since the early 1990s, it's been 3 times as fast. And it may be getting much faster than that in the future if everything goes the way that we expect it to go, which means that we could have, multiple feet of sea level rise by 2100. We could have multiple feet of sea level rise by 2100. We could have definitely a half of a foot or nearly a foot by 2030. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but it really affects everything because it gets into our groundwater and it gets into all this infrastructure that was designed not to be underwater, puts it underwater periodically because the ocean is not static. It moves up and down about 4 feet throughout the year. And throughout the day, here in Miami Beach, it'll move like 2 or 3 feet normally. So, you add a foot on top of that, you're getting a lot more underwater.
So the problem could also be a water scarcity because the salt water mixes with the fresh water supply.
Yeah, so it can be that. And that's really complicated because we've already interfered with the groundwater table. Right? So we lowered the groundwater table so that we could live here and it wouldn't flood. But that's where we get all of our drinking water from. So now that it's lower, it gets closer to the ocean, and we put in these barriers to keep that ocean water out. But as you get sea level coming up, that means that the ocean is higher than the fresh water, and it can come in underneath, or it can force us to keep those gates closed, and then when it rains, that comes up and our drainage doesn't work anymore. So it's this complicated interaction between our fresh water and our flooding. And then on top of that, there are all these implications for the environmental systems like the Everglades, Biscayne Bay, the ocean, because as they get saltier, different animals and plants are going to live there.
Yeah. And last time we talked a little bit about how people adapt to it with buildings and infrastructure. So can you maybe...
Is there a part of it that...
Yeah, when you said sometimes they adjust the buildings, there's a new way they build the streets, right?
Yeah, so there are things that we can do about sea level rise, so we can raise... Some of the things that have been happening is just to make the city higher up. So the reason we get flooding generally is because we build things like roads and bridges and buildings in places that can flood. And so really all this damage is caused by people's choices, right? And there are things that we know that we can do that will reduce the likelihood of flooding, like putting a house on top of stilts. Then the floodwater just isn't going to reach the part of the house that it can damage, right? It'll pass through underneath. And that's an old solution that is used all over the world. And in the Florida Keys, they're going back to that solution, right? So they're making first floors that have no electricity, they can be flooded and not cause damage. Here in Miami, those are considered not as desirable, right? People want to have walkable places. For businesses, you need to be able to walk up to the business and see it. So on Miami Beach, where you have a lot of high value property, they are literally raising up the streets. They're piling more dirt on and building the street higher, right?
How much higher?
Well, what happened was they decided that they would go at a minimum of 3.7 feet above sea level, using NAVD, which is a datum. So it's very hard to even measure what sea level is. So you make a choice, and then they said 3.7 feet seems reasonable to put like the top of the road. We'll put that there, and then from there we can build other structures relative to that, because it's a sequencing issue. You have a city that's already built, and do the houses and the businesses go up first, or does the road go up first? And nobody wants to go first, right? Because then water runs off into the other places. And so in Miami Beach, they put in large pumps to take the water as it rains, so it doesn't run off of the road into the buildings and the houses. It's an experiment to see if it works. But the idea is that if you build the street higher, then as a building gets redeveloped, you can build that building higher up as well. And so you just go up. But then throughout that whole process, you have to change existing rules, because there are height restrictions like that say, oh, a building can only be so high, right? And they used to measure that from sea level or from the previous level of the street. And so what they've had to do in cities like Miami Beach and Key West is change it so that they measure that from the bottom of the building to the top of the building and not from the street level, right? Because the street levels are changing. So you put a maximum height on your building, and then you also allow buildings to be built up higher, and that can help make the impact less. If you go and you look at a building like the PAM downtown, that was built adaptively. It has a wash-through bottom floor where there's car parking, but if there's a hurricane, the water can go through and the building is not floodable. And that is a kind of solution that could happen here increasingly, but you need to change the rules, and you need to change like the social norms of architecture. And so it's a big project.
And how much are other like constructions companies adjusting, with architecture firms? Is it like the norm to adapt to that, or is it still unusual to build according to those projections?
It's still unusual to build in an adaptive way in response to sea level, because it doesn't look like what people expect, maybe. And since it's not normal, it could be perceived to cost more, or it could actually cost more. And sometimes there just aren't the skills. But mostly it's just that people and institutions and architects and engineers are risk averse. They don't want to take a risk on a really expensive project, right? And so what they do is rely on the past, right? Which can lead to kind of short-sightedness, focusing on the now. But a lot of the times these projects are they're paid for and right now with a return within 5 years for the people who built it, right? Like there isn't an incentive for long-term thinking. That's the government's job. That's what we have to do as people and citizens. We have to say, hey, we want to make sure that we can still live here in 30 years. The market is not going to do that unless it's told that those are the rules, right? If they are, then the market will address those rules, but you need someone to state them and enforce them. And right now it's not there. There are definitely architects who are working on it. There are engineering firms that are developing the techniques and the technology, and there are governments that are trying to figure out how to do it, how to be adaptive, how to introduce new ideas and experiment, where you can. And so that's something that is happening. In South Florida, we have the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, which is where 4 counties got together and said, we're going to figure out a way to advocate for ourselves. So they don't necessarily set policy, but they do make policy suggestions. So they would say, like, we suggest that everyone in the 4 counties use this one sea level rise projection so that we're all making decisions based on the same science. And so they got scientists from NOAA, the Army Corps of Engineers, universities here, the Regional Water Management District, and they got them all together They worked hard and made a projection that they could all agree on with a low, a medium, and a high. And we can follow those and try and make decisions based on that.
And regarding, you mentioned the perception earlier. How do you after your research now summarize the perception among the population in Miami, and as well like in the government and policy making? How is like rise sea level even like how to say accepted?
Well, yeah. So sea level rise and climate change are interrelated. Climate change causes sea level rise, but there is still some opposition to the skepticism about the role of climate change. In South Florida and Miami, I think there's now an acceptance that sea level rise is a real thing. There are questions about how fast it's going to go up and what we can do about it. There is not the political leadership right now to push for change across the board. It's happening more in small pockets, city by city. But things are changing. It's very different than it was 5 years ago. About 10 years ago, climate change and sea level rise was just totally on the edge. It was kind of a fringe discussion here. But now there are meetings and talks every day. And the county has hired multiple employees. They're increasing their resilience division. And I think that we'll see a big change. It's changing, and people are becoming aware of it. It's just not their primary risk, right? It's not the primary risk of the political leaders, and it's not the primary risk of the voters, right? There was a poll last year that said 6% of people in Miami-Dade County say that climate change and sea level rise are their number one issue. So that doesn't mean it's not an issue. It doesn't mean they don't think it's important. They just don't think it's the most important. And my research is showing that people are not that worried. Homeowners aren't that worried yet. But if we get more flooding, and if it costs a lot more, and if it looks like we think it's going to be, with a half a foot of sea level rise, going up to 3 or 6 feet by 2100, people in South Florida are going to be willing to move away, right? The good thing is they're willing to invest in resources right now in adapting. But if we don't adapt, or if the sea level rises too fast, they're willing to move away. So I think that's the big issue, that like we have a window of opportunity. It is now, and it will close at some point. So yeah.
Are there already numbers how much rising sea levels have affected the area here, Miami Beach, Miami-Dade County?
In the
cost?
So there are estimates, but it's not massive. Like the cost of sea level rise is difficult to calculate, right? Because most of the costs are associated with normally recurring rare events like hurricanes, right? And so disentangling what is non-sea level rise related event from sea level rise, because we got this much more water over the last couple of decades. What does that mean? Like, that's very hard to measure. We know how much cities are spending on it, trying to get ready. That's a lot. I think the bigger costs are going to come from more expensive borrowing, like when it costs more to finance public debt, to pay for things, because the people who are lending you the money are not as they see the risk, and so they're not sure you're going to be able to pay back, right? So the costs aren't just like physical flooding. It's really just increased cost of doing business, right? So that's where the costs are, and that's why it's hard to calculate.
And it's also in some ways a belief, right? A belief if it's going to happen or not, based on data, on facts.
Yeah, I mean, it's a belief. We all believe what we believe.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you believe in science, if that's something that you trust, like you would trust for cancer, or like you trust to create maps of the world. There are scientific processes, and the scientific process around climate change is very strong right now. Right? There's a lot of research, and that research is clearly showing that increased greenhouse gas emissions mean that oceans are going to rise because the world is getting warmer. There are different connections, and we have some uncertainty about when exactly it will happen and how fast it will be. But rising temperatures throughout history, recorded history with people, but really the history of the whole Earth, we have records in the geology, and as the world gets hotter, the oceans go up, right? The ice melts, the oceans go up. So.
And with science, we mean you mean the empirical method of trying something out, seeing how with validation or empirical.
That means the scientific
like,
method. So the scientific method is where you observe something and you say, "Hey, I think this is what's happening. Let me test it. Let me see if it's not happening." And so you do a whole series of tests to try and figure that out, and it's done by a whole crowd of people. So imagine that you've got a whole 30,000 scientists in the world, and they're all like, "Well, I think that it's like this." Like one group is over here saying this, and another group is over here saying this, and they all talk to each other and try and figure it out, and the whole group shifts, right? And so 3 decades ago, let's say this is where people believed, they were like, "I'm not sure if climate change is real or not." The whole group has shifted over here, and there's this little bit that doesn't believe that climate change is happening the way that we think it's happening. There's this whole other group that is just trying to figure out how exactly are we getting hotter? When exactly are we going to have rising seas, and how fast are they going to be rising? That's where everybody's working now. Nobody seriously is working on whether it's happening or not, because it's done.
And what can...
It's like the question of, is cancer real? Right? We've decided cancer is real. We think it's a real thing. There's a process that we believe happens for this cellular generation. Everybody agrees that this is pretty much how cancer works. Let's look at how we can fight it. Yeah.
And what can everybody do on a personal... You talked a little bit earlier that we, as citizens, standing in for policy changes and making this, but on a daily basis, how can somebody maybe reducing carbon footprint? What does that mean?
There are a lot of ways to reduce your carbon footprint. It just means so I don't know. There are a lot of ways you can reduce your carbon emissions. You can go online and calculate your footprint. There are all these tools for it, and they will give you suggestions for how you specifically can change what you do. I think the most important thing, though...
That's some carbon footprint right there.
Yeah, there's some carbon footprint. I think, there's a lot. There's a lot that you can do, and I think that the most important thing is to admit to yourself that it's real. Admit that it's real to your family and your friends, and elect leaders that say it's real, right? And then tell them, "Hey, I want you to deal with this problem. I'm worried about it. I think it's one of the important problems. I see that it's connected to everything." So really tell the story to yourself. That is important. Go calculate your carbon footprint online, and then understand that the choices that you make every day impact it, and that the choices that we make every day in terms of investing in our cities, they impact whether we'll be able to live here.
So it makes a huge difference if we use less plastic bags, for instance, like the production plastics, or drive less car?
I don't think so.
No?
I mean, you could drive less, you could do those small things. We need to do it as a society. I don't really. We have to change the rules. And energy production, there are... The major users of energy are transportation and housing, right? energy isn't bad, but we get most of ours from fossil fuels, so that's bad. We can change the policy so that we make our energy from renewable resources. That would be good. Or you can use less energy, and there are all kinds of ways to be more efficient. You have to do the ones that are easiest for you. And you have to be careful not to have a single action bias, which is where you're just like, I did one thing, now I don't have to do everything else. You're like, oh, I recycled that bag, I guess I can go, you know, just dump a whole bunch of other carbon into the atmosphere. Like, it doesn't work that way. Yeah. The only real solution is for us to come together, though. This is a collective problem. This is something we have to set the rules together, right? It's not. This is like a collective issue. It's not an issue that one person deals with, but everybody can be a part of it. Yeah.
And just like for like to make it a little like feel tangible, how much is like 1 foot of water till just the lower estimate, right? It's like 1 foot of water till 2030, 2030. How much water is that like on the global planet? How many gallons of water?
I have no idea.
But
I don't know. I don't know any of those numbers. Yeah.
We calculate it's like quadrillion or something.
Yeah. I mean, it's not. But the thing is, we're not going to get a foot of sea level rise everywhere, right? We're going to get different sea level rises in different places. Florida's going to get sea level rise that's higher than some other areas because we're not uplifting like Norway, and because we're fairly far away from the ice caps, and as the ice caps melt, they have all this gravity, right? There's just so much weight trapped in those ice caps that they're actually pulling the oceans toward them, and so as they melt, the water goes more towards the center of the globe, and it moves that way, and so that's part of how we'll have more sea level rise. And they've seen more sea level rise on the east coast of the United States. This is documented as Greenland's been melting, and it looks like it's further away. It doesn't rise right next to Greenland. It actually, what happens is as the ice goes away and spreads more evenly as water, the gravity causes the oceans to rise like in the mid-Atlantic. That's what they think is happening. This is what that's the kind of thing scientists are talking about. You know, not is the ocean going up, but how, why, where, right? Yeah, and you know, I mean, a foot is a foot. You have a foot of sea level rise, right? But just think about that water coming up, just there, and like all the little problems that you would get if you had a foot of water on anything.
And you also mentioned the last time that it's not necessarily the foot when it's like low tide or something, but when like a storm comes and there's a high tide.
Yeah.
What happened during...
So flooding, the thing about sea level rise is that even a couple of inches of sea level rise causes flooding to increase. So we have systems that are built to deal with 5 inches of rain within an hour regularly, right? Because that's a lot of water, but that's what happens fairly normally in South Florida. So that standard doesn't work as well when you have even a couple of inches of sea level rise, because it pushes the groundwater up. And then when it rains those 5 inches and we have a system that dumps the water into the ground, and the ground is already full of water, and there's nowhere for it to go, so you get flooding in the street, and it'll back up until the tide goes down. So it doesn't matter how good your systems are. If there's nowhere for the water to go, it's going to flood.
And you mentioned last times somebody you've met was already affected by that on a regular basis with flooding. He's somewhere here. I don't know if it was North Miami or...
I mean, there are
Palm Beach
people who are already affected by flooding. Part of it is because we built on fill, so the ground is collapsing a little bit. Mostly the places that are affected by flooding right now are the most recent developments, right? So like parts of Miami Beach that were filled in later, or parts of the city of Miami like that they didn't let people live in because it would flood normally until they built some houses in the 60s and 70s, right? After we controlled the flooding with big canals, right? And so initially they weren't allowed to build there, but now they have. And so those are the places that are flooding right now. But yeah, there are communities that are being affected all over. There are parks along the Miami River that flood at king tide every year, right? This park right here floods, and so they're adding dirt to it so it'll go higher, right?
And there's also something you mentioned, like the sand, right? They're running out of sand in Miami.
Yeah, that's a different issue. I mean, it'll be affected by. I mean, it's affected by sea level rise. So sea level rise causes faster erosion, but they no longer have local sand that can be mined out in the ocean and placed on the beach. So we have to import the sand from other places, and it's complicated because it has to be the same color to protect turtles, and it's a mess.
Wow, where's the sand coming from then?
I think it's from Central Florida right now. Yeah, they've looked at a bunch of different places, but none of the coastal communities will give us their sand because they need it. So I think it has to be inland, so it has to be trucked.
Another footprint.
Yep.
And then two more questions. The one you mentioned also that climate change and global warming has an effect because the warmer the water gets, the more it also expands, right?
Yeah. Oh, so how does sea level rise happen? So there are a couple of ways that sea level rise happens. The kind of famous one is glaciers melting, right? And so far that's caused like a little bit of sea level rise. And it could cause feet of sea level rise if Greenland and Antarctica are melting, right? But one of the major drivers of sea level rise is that when you get something hotter, it takes up more space. It's just basic physics. When it's hotter, it takes up more space, it expands. And that's what's happening with the ocean. The ocean is getting warmer. A lot of the heat that's being created by the greenhouse gas effect is going into the ocean. And that is causing the ocean to expand. So it's just bigger on a molecular level, which is driving sea level rise. And that's mostly what we're seeing, and that's where we think the acceleration is coming from.
And then who can they be in contact with? What are some organizations, some communities you've been aware of?
Who should they talk to here?
Yeah, are there some local?
The Clio Institute is a really great resource. Miami Climate Alliance has some information if you want to be more politically active. There are a lot of organizations that you could reach through them who are dealing with environmental issues. I think that those are really important. And also Miami-Dade County has a newsletter about resilience that you should sign up for.
Nice.
Because that is a really great way to get information about what's going on.
Ooh, thank you so much.